Good morning, audiobooks all day. What a pleasure it is to be with you on this fine day, where we are going to talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And we're going to get into it, but this book is amazing. And every single person who's a fan of horror genre needs to listen to it on Audible. If you haven't, your understanding of what and who Frankenstein and his monster are, or the modern Prometheus, as we would be apt to call it from the title, will shift totally after reading this book. I do want to start off with one of my favorite quotes. This is said right in about the middle of the book. It says, "Beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful."
Oof.
That is pretty amazing. I wanted to just start off with just saying a little bit, and then Kevin, you can swoop up here because I know that you've done a little bit of research here. But Mary Shelley is the author, and she does an incredible job at expository type writing in this. And it's fun because this book, like as a whole, it actually shifts different perspectives. So different people start telling different parts of the story. It kind of goes from the cruise ship to Victor Frankenstein to the creature back to a captain on a ship. It's really cool to hear each different perspective and then to have it be filled in. And so she does a great job at that. Kevin, do you want to tell us a little bit more about Mary Shelley and why she's so amazing?
Yeah, so Mary Shelley, she started writing this book in 1816 when she was 18 years old. And the book was first published 2 years later in 1818, which at the time, for a woman to be able to be publishing a book was a really big deal. Like most women authors of the day, her book was originally published anonymously. However, in 1823, so 5 years later after the first publication, the second edition came out and it had her name on it and had her name on ever since, which made her, if not the first, one of the first women ever to write a book and not use a pseudonym. True, she did start anonymous, but she wrote it as a suit. She never used a pseudonym, which is really, really impressive and really brave. And I think adds, for somebody, it makes it almost even more impressive that this book that, because she had to overcome a lot of obstacles that a lot of male writers at the time didn't have to overcome. But even taking that aside, this is a fantastic book. And for those of you who are just familiar with the modern Frankenstein, the slow-moving Boris Karloff, he's alive, Igor-type Frankenstein, this is very different. A lot of those elements exist, but there are a lot of differences too, which for me added a lot to this book and made it more exciting and in many ways better.
And, nothing caps it off differently than having the very beginning of the book be in the North Pole. So you immediately get dropped into the North Pole with Captain Walton, who is on a ship, and it actually starts out so ominously and so scarily. So, like, just imagine, like, you're on a ship and you literally see nothing. It's just ice. And you and your crew haven't seen anything for a really long time. And then the ship is actually right now, going through it's on a scientific expedition. And while they're going, you just see this big, large creature. You don't know what it is. And then it passes and then it just goes and you kind of like, it disappears. And you and your crew are like, what in the heck was that? And then you come across a small, emaciated man who has a really scary story to tell. And like, I just loved how it set it up. You kind of like see this, these guys see this big hulking creature, and then you find this guy. So they yoink Frankenstein up, and then they set him on the deck, and then that's when they kind of start to hear his story.
Right. And, so the person they bring up is Victor Frankenstein, who is the doctor who creates the creature. And that's how they're referred to in the book, as the creature, or I believe they mentioned the monster, but it's mostly the creature. It's not Frankenstein's monster. It's not Frankenstein. It is just the creature. Small little fun fact. But, he goes on to tell the story. And, like Jeff was saying, it's from a bunch of different perspectives, but they're all first-person perspective. They're not third-person perspective like a lot of modern fiction books are written in, where you're from somebody's perspective, but you're still a omniscient writer. And but this is all pure first-person I language, which is not a very common writing style nowadays, but she does it fantastically. And, Victor Frankenstein starts to tell the story of, starts from the very beginning. I was born and I did things and I grew up and, gets to the point where he's in college and just gets fascinated with, learning about, the human body and just starts doing a lot of crazy experiments.
Yeah, I mean, so it really all starts when his mom dies of scarlet fever, and then he just starts to experiment, and his in his sadness, he wants to try and find solutions, and so he winds up being, uh, yeah, he he winds up creating the creature, but the creature is proportionally weird and it's 8 feet tall, and
Right.
he
It's super
creates
big,
it.
super strong.
And but then there comes a moment where he leaves and comes back and the creature's gone. And then that's really where everything starts to come off the rails. Um, and essentially what needs to happen is that Victor's perspective kind of ends with a pretty big tragedy. And so there's a young boy who winds up getting murdered by the creature. And he witnesses this. And in fact, Kevin, so it was, how are they related to him again?
They called him his brother. I don't remember if he was his actual brother or like he was adopted. I don't recall, but they referred to him as his brother.
Yeah, no, it is his brother. Yeah, this letter, he receives a letter from his father notifying him that his brother dies. And then anyways, to deal with his grief, he just kind of hops off the mat and he goes into the Alps. He's a big climber, and then suddenly the creature actually approaches him and really wants to tell his side of the story. And then that's when it shifts from from Victor Frankenstein to the creature. And this is where some of my favorite writing exists, because the creature is not just some super dumb, puts its arms out and kind of walks around and just kills stuff kind of creature.
Right. So like we said, so Victor, he creates the creature and then he has like this insane nervous breakdown or emotional breakdown. Like, what have I done? This is insane. What am I doing? And when he finally comes back to his laboratory, the creature's gone. And this is the story that the creature's telling about how he just goes off into the woods. He woke up and he was completely alone. He had a few papers and stuff, but he was just completely alone. And he walks out into the woods and he sees people and he doesn't understand what they're doing, but they look different than him. And he just starts listening and he just sees this very average family just living an average life. Well, more of a humble life. They, had some drawbacks, but they were a family and they were, they loved each other. And he started to learn the language and just became enamored with these people and just, had no human contact, had no contact with anybody, since he'd been created. And he just starts to yearn and yearn and yearn to connect with these people.
Yeah, and Frankenstein, the thing that the monster, what he keeps harping on is that he is completely alone in the world. And there's a couple quotes that I really liked from him. He said, while he's telling the story, he says, "All joy was but mockery, which insulted my desolate state, and made me feel more painfully that I was not made for the enjoyment of pleasure." And then he also says, "Everywhere I see bliss, from which I am alone, for which I alone am irrevocably excluded." He just feels completely isolated because there's nothing else like him. And he just doesn't understand how he can be something. So he has a request for Frankenstein. He says, "I need you to make me a wife. I need to not be alone. I am much too alone." And he
back up real quick. But the thing is, when he finally does approach this family, they're terrified of him. And they think that he's attacking them, and they attack him and just run him out. And then they come back later and they've moved because they're so afraid of him. So he's not only is he yearning to be with these people, he has recognized that I am ugly, I'm deformed, I am, this monster, and everybody hates me. And then he goes to, at the end of his story, then he, like Jeff, like you were saying, like, then he asks Frankenstein, "Now make me a wife so I don't have to be alone."
Yep. And in there too, he does confirm that he does wind up, killing his brother, which was just a really, because he's so strong and he wanted the boy to stop crying, and it's just like, oh my gosh, it was pretty messed up and scary. And then it was kind of at that point where Frankenstein says, and I remember this, it's like, I am malicious because I am miserable. I was like, dang, that's pretty deep.
And, I feel like there's this really big theme throughout the whole book of, the idea of nature versus nurture. Right. And I feel like in Frankenstein's story, the creature's story, this is the most dramatic, but it does with throughout the whole book. It talks kind of about that nature versus nurture. And the creature is completely convinced that that everything is nurture. That because they weren't loved, because they've been miserable, because they've been outcast, they are a product of their surroundings. And not to get too much into with raising children with nature versus nurture, because I do, there are, been a lot of evidences in my life that both are impactful. However, it's really just this dramatic look of, hey, how the creature feels is like, hey, Frankenstein, you are my creator. You brought me into this world and you abandoned me. And you gave me nothing, and you made me ugly, and you made me a monster, and you made me terrible, and everybody hates me just by looking at me. And the few people who have seen him have attacked him. In fact, once he even telling in his story, he jumps in the water to save this little girl, and he saves her. And then when the parents of the little girl actually catch up to him, they shoot him because they think he's attacking him, even though he just saved her life. And that he is just feels that he is a complete product of his circumstances. And he's convinced that, all right, if I'm going to be unhappy, Frankenstein, you need to fix this. And you need to fix this.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. He said, so first of all, something that we had left out about the whole situation with the young boy is that Frankenstein incriminates his mom. You remember he takes a locket, like William's locket, and he puts it in the mom's dress, which is pretty horrible. So yeah, Victor's finally kind of persuaded. He's like, okay, well, the only real way to get this creature out and to be safe is to build the second one. And so he actually starts working on it. But then the creature gives Victor a final threat. Like, if he doesn't finish it, he says, I will be with you on your wedding night. And that's kind of what sets up this whole next part of the book. So now the book kind of reverts back over to Frankenstein, and it's his anguish of, this whole will I, won't I build a second creature, being threatened by Frankenstein, deciding to not build the creature, and then him essentially now hunting the creature, but then falling in love. And I was actually something that I was really impressed with Mary Shelley's narrative was how she spoke about love and their relationship and how deep and wonderful it was as Victor, marries Elizabeth and all of this stuff. And it really was probably one of the hardest parts of the book was that part, is now that Victor's in love, but he's always constantly looking over his shoulder for the creature.
Right. And he takes that, that threat seriously, and they get married, and it's on their wedding night, and he's like, okay, the monster's going to come and get me. The monster's going to attack me. So he pulls out a revolver, and he asks his brand new wife to wait in the room upstairs, and, he's ready. And then here's this big crash. And in that moment, he realizes that the monster never intended to come after him on his wedding night, but come after Elizabeth. And he runs upstairs just to see the monster leave, and the monster had killed his new wife.
Yeah, which also cascades to his father dying. And then now he just goes on this worldwide hunt for the creature. He goes all across Europe, goes to Russia, and then up into the Arctic, which is where now we meet Victor. And right at that point, it goes back now to Captain Walton, where he starts to kind of break down the story and his thoughts on it.
And, and Frankenstein's super weak from all this adventure, and super weak from chasing Frankenstein. And eventually, after he tells his story, he eventually passes away. And the captain comes into the room and he sees, Frankenstein on the bed who's just passed away, and he sees the creature who's just looking at Frankenstein. And he's like, the creature's like, well, just he hated Frankenstein. He hated him with every fiber of his being. And his entire existence was centered around making Frankenstein miserable. And then he gets to the end and it's like, I don't have anything to live for anymore. That's it. I don't have anything else.
Well, and then he just drifts away on the ice at the very end. And when I think about what I take away from this book, I take away a lot about like, what does life truly mean? Because I do think that this will be a question now that essentially humans will be able to create life in really new, interesting, and really scary ways in the future. Is what is life? Not just from like the iRobot robot perspective, but also from gene editing, gene enhancement, stem cell creation, us creating duplicates of ourselves. I mean, like there's a lot of really interesting, relevant things that we can learn from Frankenstein. Is that one? And I would have no idea how an actual human being who was maybe synthetically created or lab created would feel, but I could see how they would feel apart from the world, not connected to anything, not a part of the broader human story, feeling isolated, feeling like a monster, feeling like that there was other people like them that they could assimilate with. Now Frankenstein is at a disadvantage because he's so big and looks so scary. But I do think that these are really good ethical questions that we can look at, because the creature was never ever satisfied, and all it really wanted was something like it. And Frankenstein was in the end not able to provide that for him, and it just led to misery for everyone. And so when I look at some of these, you kind of look at what life means. Life, it seems like every single time in a movie or in a book, whenever humans take an active role in trying to create life, not save it, not sustain it, not make it better, but to create it, it does seem that it never goes well. Yet, there's beautiful things like IVF, and that's not what I'm referring to. I'm mainly referring to like, hey, if we have severe population decreases, and so people just start creating humans, I just wonder what their perspective would be on life when you don't really come from something, when you're separated from the larger human narrative. I could see how that could be really difficult. And so anyway, I actually think that this is a super relevant story for today, because I do foresee humans being able to mess with life so much more. I mean, you will literally, and at some point be able to gene edit your ideal child. You'll be able to make them bigger, stronger, better looking. We'll be able to, I mean, and this is pretty wild, but I mean, at some point, maybe they could edit out all, sort of gene deformities, different things like that. I mean, it really is kind of a scary thing. And I look at the effect that it had on Victor for doing it, and then on the creature for being it. And so bottom line is, like, I don't know what any of the answers are. I don't really know where the future's going. It's so largely out of my hands. But mainly, I just think that it is actually a pretty good cautionary tale for how it is on the person that violates some of the general rules of life, and on the person that it was done to. I think that in that case, they both wound up being victims of this. And so I think a pretty good cautionary tale.
Yeah. I like you're saying, I think there's a lot of really, really, really relevant things. And one of them that you touched upon is just, Victor just does it and really doesn't think about the consequences of his actions. And like you said, that breeds a huge cascade effect. And we're in a really exciting time in the world where we're creating a lot of things. And it's important to always review those with the moral implications of what we're doing. And I'm not trying to push, a singular moral narrative, but to really stop and think, is what I'm doing the right thing? Or what am I doing that is something that could be taken incorrectly or could be used in the wrong way? Or how can this be abused? Because Victor didn't ask any of those questions. And it ruined his life, and it ruined the life of the creature, and it killed many of the people he loved. But you talked about relevancy. And you're absolutely right in many of the ways that it's relevant. And I wanted to highlight one of the things that you said, because to me that this is the most important way that this is relevant. We live in a world that is increasingly lonely. We live in a world where people have the ability to be connected in ways that they never have been before. And yet people, especially in the older and younger generations, have never been more disconnected from others. And there are, Victor was not the hero of this story. The creature was not the hero of this story. They both did things that were wrong, and in many cases horrible. And that grief and anguish drove them to do more terrible things and to hunt each other until the end. And at the end of the day, what drove them is that loneliness and that isolation. And that's a scary thing, and it's a real thing, and it's very, very relevant. And for me, what I took away from this, thinking about this, I thought, because one of the themes is that nobody understands what Victor's going through. He never explains it to anybody, and everybody just thinks he's fine. And inside he's dying, and, emotionally. And just that you don't always know what people are going through, and sometimes it's really, really dramatic. And just to think a little bit more about the people around me and the people in my life, because they might be going through something similar. They might be going through something hard. They might be going through that just insane loneliness or isolation, and just to be more mindful of those around me. And I think if we can do that, well, that's a pretty great lesson to take away from this book.
And to throw one last quote that's right in line with that, Frankenstein says this, the creature says this, hateful day when I receive life. Accursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous even you turned away from me in disgust? God in pity made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid even from the very resemblance. Satan and his companions, fellow devils, to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and abhorred. I just found it so amazing that he even looks at the devil and knows that he has fellow devils to be with him, and that he was truly, truly alone. And I think that that's a pretty bad place to get to when you are even jealous of that. I think that that's a great point to kind of leave on. We hope that you guys have a happy Halloween. I think that definitely something I've learned from doing all of these horror books is that they are so much more deep. It's not about the cheap, it's not about the cheap scares. It's about actually the more meaningful, longful, scary situations that we could find ourselves in of maybe not having a purpose in life anymore. And anyway, it was great to have you all here. Kevin, any final thoughts?
Have a great day.
Have a great day. Peace.